Oni sobie szepczą, a to sobie professor will start listening. Hello everybody. Welcome to another DH Lunch this year. Today our guest is Dr. Gustavo Fernandez Riva, originally from Argentina, but right now residing at the Universidade Nova de Lisboa in Portugal. And Gustavo has been researching here for 2 weeks various issues, and today he will talk to us a little bit about his network, his analysis of network of medieval manuscript transmission, which I believe is a topic of interest to many of the people gathered here and online. So without further gossips and stuff, I hand you the voice, and please everybody enjoy the lunch.
Well, thanks, Joanna, for the introduction. Thanks, Magda, for organizing this talk. I'm very happy to be able to do it. And thanks, Maciej, for the general invitation to Krakow. It's been 2 amazing weeks of research. And so today I'm going to talk about medieval manuscripts. So first, I would like to make a very small overview of why medieval manuscripts are important and how they have been studied in the past, and in which way so my work fits into that context and maybe can do something new in manuscript studies. So manuscripts have always been important for medievalists, and medievalists have studied manuscripts, have studied their ways of production, circulation, destruction. They have studied how manuscripts were read and used in different ways, how they interact with oral discourse and with culture in general. And these studies have been performed with a variety of methods. And this interest in manuscripts is understandable for many reasons. From the perspective of textual criticism, 2 facts make manuscripts extremely important: scarcity and variation. This means that for many texts, there are very few sources available, and they never have exactly the same text. Due to the features of hand copying technology and many other historical and cultural features, each copy meant some level of alteration. In some cases, simple errors; in many other cases, intentional changes that could range from spelling to deleting or adding whole passages. In this context, traditional textual editors were interested in reconstructing a textual archetype, a text as close as possible to an unvariable authorial text, and to achieve that, they needed to pay close attention to the whole sources for a particular work. And while manuscripts are important for reconstructive textual criticism, they are even more important for the opposite perspective. For many editors, each witness should be valued in itself, as it is a document of a particular time and use of that text. And some scholars have always had this kind of perspective, but the Überlieferungsgeschichte in Germany and the New Philology are 2 branches of textual criticism that have insisted upon it. And nowadays, the availability of digital facsimiles has made this position even more attractive, as we can study in detail the text and features of many manuscripts without the need to travel. And you can imagine how much this changes the stage for those of us coming from the American continent, where the actual objects are thousands of kilometers away. And this links to another reason for the interest in medieval manuscripts: they are valuable patrimonial objects. Even abstracting ourselves from the text, manuscripts offer many other features worth investigating. They are a material link to the Middle Ages. As many manuscripts were also luxury objects with a representative function, with beautiful images, handwriting and layout, they are in themselves an aesthetic object. So with this introduction, I intend to say that manuscripts have been deeply studied in the past. So I don't pretend to offer any new revolutionary knowledge, but I do intend to offer an approach to the analysis of manuscript aided by computational methods that can hopefully give us some new, humble insights. So, as the title of the presentation says, I want to focus on transmission, and this means two things. On the one hand, focusing on manuscripts as transmitters, that is, as the objects where texts are transmitted, because as I said before, there are many other ways to approach manuscript studies, but I will restrict myself to consider manuscripts in this way, as the place where the texts are contained. On the other hand, transmission means manuscripts as communication between the time of their creation and the present. So I am focusing on the set of objects available in the present and try to infer some features about the production, circulation, and destruction of manuscripts throughout their history. So my idea for the presentation is to show a network of shared manuscript transmission. This means modeling the manuscript transmission using a mathematical model, the network, the graph, in order to better understand it. And the main questions that I'm going to be asking to this model is, what is the role of miscellany manuscripts in the transmission of medieval German texts? Is it possible to detect tendencies in the grouping of works in miscellany manuscripts? That is, are similar works transmitted in the same manuscript contents? And is it possible to detect survival strategies of works based on their shared textual transmission? With survival strategies, I use the term in a sort of metaphorical way to try to understand some features of this shared transmission can explain that some manuscripts and some texts were lost and others survived to the present. So to do this research, I took the data from the online manuscript database called Handschriftencensus, which, as it says from the website, aims at capturing the whole German language manuscript patrimony of the Middle Ages. It deals with circa 26,000 manuscripts and fragments from the time between 750 and 1520, scattered and sometimes even disassembled into single pages in more than 1,500 libraries, collections, and archives around the world. And this project, Handschriftencensus, began in 2006, and it has been carried out mainly in Marburg and in Paderborn in Germany, and since 2015 it's based in Mainz in the Academy of Sciences there. So it's a project with a relatively long history that started at a point where there were some technologies for web databases available, and they sort of continue working with the same kind of technology since 2006. So when we go to the website, what we have is of course, an index and an entry for each manuscript in the database, which has information about the place where it's kept and some description of the document itself, like how many pages, what's it made of, and especially important for us in this case, the content, Inhalt. And then we also have entries for each work, and that have some information about secondary literature, etc. But most important for us, information about the witnesses, the manuscripts where this work is present. So as there is no direct access to the underlying database, what I had to do to be able to collect the data is to use web scraping in order to get some sort of data. What I did was create a file with a very simple structure that has all the works in the database and a list of the manuscripts that witness that work, a list of the manuscripts where that work appears. And so, with this, I created a series of graphs that if you have an internet connection right now, you can see there. I will show slides of them, but in this address, you can have them in a better definition as SVG files. And don't worry, the address is still there. So when I use that database to create a network, it looks something like this. It looks something sort of spatial, like some sort of galaxy or planetary system. And I will try to explain how this is built by focusing on a small part. Yeah, we're going to see now in detail that small part which is inside that yellow rectangle. Yeah, so if we go there, we see this is what's in that. Yeah, is this. And what we have is each node in this network is a text. Yeah, and two texts have a link, an edge connecting them when they appear together in at least one manuscript. Yeah? When they appear together in several manuscripts, the edge connecting them is wider. Yeah? So, for example, in this case, we can see that the text and the top, Heinrich Kudorfer Alchemische Rezepte, appears in one manuscript together with Ulmanus Buch der Heiligen Dreifaltigkeit. And then this book, Ulmanus, appears in another manuscript together with Solum Luna, which appears in manuscripts together with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different texts. Yeah? And for example, if we look at the other part where we have the wider links, we see that, for example, Johannes Meyer Papstchronik and Johannes Meyer Vitas Fratum appear together in more than one manuscript. So right now, just by seeing at how wide it is, it's hard to say how many, but it's clearly a lot more. So this is how the network was built. And we have about 6,000 works, 6,000 texts, 6,000 nodes in the network. And when we see the whole, it has this shape, and it's divided in 3 main areas that I decided to name using a geographical metaphor as islands, archipelagos, and the continent. Yeah. So what does this mean? So this is a disconnected graph, which means that not all nodes are connected to each other. And we have on the edge in green the islands. The islands are nodes that have no connections at all. So are very lonesome texts that when they are in a manuscript, they are alone. It's important to make the difference between being an island in this case and being an unicum, a text with only one witness. One text could have 5 witnesses, for example, 5 manuscripts where it appears. But if in all those manuscripts it appears alone, then it's an island. Yeah? We're going to see that these 2 concepts are somehow interrelated, but they are not the same. Then, we have in the middle, in this violet color, the continent, which is a huge group of texts that are all interconnected. Yeah, it's what's called a connected component in network theory. So from any node in that group, we can make a path to any other node. Yeah. And then we have in the middle what I call the archipelagos, that are small groups of connected components. So small groups of 2, 3, or 4 texts that are connected to each other, but not with any other group. Yeah? And so if we see the percentage of works in different areas of the network, we see that most of them are inside that continent in the middle. There's 18% of island and only 6% of archipelagos. And this is interesting for many reasons. I mean, when I saw the result for the first time, I was a little surprised because I would have expected to have even more islands, as we have a lot of fragments in the database. And we can assume that some of these fragments were in miscellany manuscripts, that is, manuscripts that were a collection of text, but as we only have a fragment, so that manuscript appears as only having one text. And so actually in this, in our results, the destruction of manuscripts would tend to create a bias towards having more islands than actually were produced at the moment. And however, they are relatively few. And then what also surprised me is that most works are actually inside the continent. And this is interesting because why do we have only one continent? I mean, the other connected component, the archipelagos, are all very small. Most of them have only 2, 3, up to 4 texts. How are there no bigger connected components apart from this huge continent? And we can have some conclusions about, take some conclusions from that fact. And one of them is that miscellany manuscripts that collect a big number of texts, must be relatively common, because the only way to explain this is that we have a lot of manuscripts that have lots of texts in them. And the other conclusion is that there is no strict separation in genres when we consider manuscript transmission. If, for example, let's suppose a kind of transmission where profane literature and religious literature are strictly divided and are not considered to be apt to put together, we would tend to have 2 continents, or at least one continent with only a few exceptional links connecting the 2 parts. And this is not the case. Inside the continent, there is a very good interconnectivity, which means there is not a very strong separation of genres. Although, as we will see, we can determine some clusters, some tendency to put similar texts together. So let's talk a little bit about what this, what can we know, what can we extract from this data about survival. Yeah. So, as I said before, unica in plural, so it's like the works that are attested in only one manuscript. And if we highlight them in color, here in pink, we see that these texts are all over the place. So in the 3 areas, we have texts that appear in only one manuscript. And we see that from in the whole corpus, actually more than half of the texts are attested in only one manuscript. And so only 14% in 2, 7.5% in 3, and this percentage is smaller as we consider a higher number of witnesses. We can see the same information displayed in this kind of plot, where we see this very fast fall of the number of witnesses according to the number of texts. Yeah. If we see This is another way to see it. And if we zoom here a little bit, we see that we have some distant number of witnesses up to like 6 or 7. More than 10, we have very few witnesses, and started in 20, for any number of witnesses we consider, we only have 0 or 1 text. Now, the question, oh, sorry, the other way. Oops, okay. So, the question we can ask, so then we see that there are this only one witness a little bit everywhere, and that the number of witnesses is relatively small for most works. But what I wanted to ask is, let's consider this way. So, like 55% of all works are unica, so they are in only one witnesses. 82% of all works are not islands, so they are connected to another text. And so this means that 40% of all works are attested in only one witness, but are not islands. But on the other side of the coin, 83% of the islands are also unica. So most of the islands are actually attested in only one witness, even though we have works with only one witness everywhere. So the question is there a correlation between having few witnesses and having few connections in the graph? And if we try to compute that using Pearson's correlation coefficient, we get that there's some sort of correlation, not a very strong one, but a statistically significant correlation. Yeah, this 0.39 is sort of a not a very strong correlation, but a correlation that exists. So this is interesting from the perspective of survival, because we can consider different survival strategies for a work. One of the most obvious but most difficult to model is popularity, success. So if a work is very popular, people are going to copy it more often, so it's more likely that it survives. But with this model, we can also have this hypothesis that a work that can be inserted in different manuscript contexts, so a work that can be together with, in miscellany manuscripts with other works, has also better chances of surviving. And this is interesting, for example, if we calculate the centrality of some of the nodes using the eigenvector centrality, that is, considering not only how central a node is, but also how central are the nodes to which it is connected, we see that the texts with the highest eigenvector centrality are Cato and Freydank. Cato is the German translation of the Distica Catonis, which are these sort of proverbial wisdom and morality treatise. And Freydank is very similar, only it's a medieval German original text, which is also short fragments with moral content. And the feature of both these texts is that they can go anywhere. They're short texts, and so you can have religious manuscripts. So one of these texts, if you have space, you can include them, because why not have some moral learning in there? If you have epic poetry, well, it also goes there. If you have short stories, anything you have, any of these texts can be inserted in that collection. And we can see the same sort of functioning at the lower level. For example, if you consider not the most central text, but for example, a relatively central text, which is the poetry of Walter von der Vogelweide, it's there sort of linking the cluster we see in the lower left, that's most of the lyrical poetry, yeah? Walter von der Vollweide was a poet that composed love lyric, but also political lyric, political poetry, and was probably the most famous poet in medieval Germany. So his works are also sort of a link between the lyrical poetry cluster and the rest of the network, because he was not only very famous, but also very versatile, having different kinds of poems. So, let's focus a little bit on these archipelagos that are actually only a small part of the network. So it's 344 texts, which is only 6%. And what I did here is I just took those nodes out of the whole network and created this sort of circular visualization. And we have the different communities, the different clusters in the same color. So when we have these interconnections, and we see that we have a lot of communities, like most of them only have 2 or 3 texts. We can see here the stronger the color, it means that there are more texts interconnected. And we see that there are very few that have more than 4 or 5 texts. And somehow this perspective can be useful to reassess some of the data we have, some of the manuscripts. For example, the biggest connected component here is this group of texts. It's 8 texts that are all in this manuscript, Hannover Landesbibliothek L81. And so these texts are only in that manuscript, and that manuscript has only those texts. And there is no other manuscript in the whole database that has so many unica and only so many unica. And this is, for me at least, when I saw this, it was a little bit surprising, considering how we tend to think about the transmission of medieval texts, that there was only one manuscript that had so many unica. Like how relatively important the connectivity of the network is, and the grouping of texts in the transmissions. So, and finally, we come to the continent. So, the main features of this very interconnected continent, it has the longest path. So if we choose any node and we want to get to another node, we create a path. And the longest path possible in this network is 11. Yeah? Which means there are only 3 texts. That is what is in the periphery that has this longest path. Yeah. The average path. So if we take two random nodes, then the average path is 3.2. But then we consider the radius, that is the texts that have the smallest path to be able to reach any other text. That's the center, so these 50 texts that only need 6 steps to get to any other node. And so it reminds me, probably you've heard about that very classical social network game, which is called 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, where you choose any actor and you try to find a link to Kevin Bacon by the times they appear in the same films, and you're supposed to be able to do it in only 6 degrees. So with medieval German manuscripts, you can also play a similar game. So this means that at least as I can interpret that, the network is pretty well connected. But what I would like to do in the future is to create similar networks for other transmission, for example, for French text or for Latin text, and compare these numbers. And so having them in context, I think, could give us even more valuable information about about how manuscript culture worked for those different languages. A question we can ask to this continent is if there are clusters inside of it. So, and in case there are, if they have something in common apart from their manuscript context. That is, if similar texts are actually transmitted in a similar manuscript context. So if we apply a community detection algorithm, here we get, for example, with this with relatively average features to calculate it, 15 communities. And so each community is here, the nodes of each community are painted, displayed in a particular color. And it's interesting, we start exploring a little bit, that we can start to appreciate some tendencies. Yeah. For example, a very general one. What's on the left of this line tends to be what we could call fiction. So short stories, romance, love poetry, love discourses. While on the other side we have the more non-fiction literature, so to say, religious literature, sermons, law literature, historical literature. And if we go with more detail, we can sort of start seeing that these clusters sort of overlap with genre distinctions. So the most distinguishable cluster is lyrical poetry. So the poetry has, especially love poetry, is really transmitted in their own manuscripts that is relatively weakly linked with the rest of the network. So we saw, for example, Walter von der Vogelweide is one of the links uniting it with other works. It's interesting then, for example, that höfische Roman and Heldenepic, so courtly romance and epic poetry, tends to be very related. So some are two genres that sometimes are considered like very antithetical, but in the manuscript transmission they are actually very united. And then we have interesting cases where we have like the Minneheden and the Märchen, so the love discourses and short stories in verse that sort of are not unequally distributed within the same cluster. So it's like the green cluster here in the picture, the green cluster and the orange cluster, both of them have Minneheden and Märchen, but they are distributed among the two of them. It's not that one is Minneheden and the other one is Märchen, which means that these two genres, at least from the perspective of manuscript transmission, are very interrelated. So when medieval scribes were compiling manuscripts, they tended to add words from both of these genres. And of course, we need to remember that these genres are creations of modern literary critics, modern literary historians, trying to make sense of the materials and not actual concepts for medieval public. And it's also maybe interesting to consider some exceptions to these general rules, like for example, that's a small group of Minneheden, of love discourses, that is closely related to law and sapiential literature. Yeah. So these clusters is also important to remember. They are tendencies. It's not that we cannot find text from other genres which within the group of Minenheden. But if we consider the overall picture, we get this sort of overlap between genres and clusters in the network. There are some other questions we can ask. For example, which are the texts that have the biggest common transmission? So that is the text that appear together in the highest number of manuscripts. And we have, like, in 62 common manuscripts, we have this Vocabularius et quo and Liber Ordines Rerum, which are both Latin-German dictionaries, and with 66, these two law texts about Bavarian law texts. And the idea of, for example, considering these kind of things is to help us better assess the transmission, the manuscript transmission of other texts also. Because if we consider the manuscript transmission of a particular text, and we want to know, okay, has this text especially big manuscript transmission, or are these two texts appear in many manuscripts together? Okay, but how does this fit within the overall picture, within the whole context of the whole medieval German manuscript transmission? So, some conclusions and looking forward. So, one of the things, I mean, this is not really something absolutely new. It's things that many scholars might have already suspected, but it's interesting for me to create a mathematical model that can help us reassess these ideas. One of them is that miscellany manuscript, that is manuscripts that collect many different texts, are the rule and not the exception. That less witnesses are more common as many. Well, that's pretty clear. Interesting, as we said, that texts transmitted in miscellany manuscripts have bigger chances of survival, and that there is no clear division of genres in the transmission, but texts tend to be transmitted together with other texts in their same genre. How I think this kind of analysis could continue in the future? As I mentioned already, we can have this kind of analysis for other languages, like French or Latin, or maybe even for manuscripts that have texts in different languages, which also happens. And this, when we have this information in a comparative perspective, I think some of the data could be a lot more meaningful. We can also consider creating different kind of networks using this data. So, for this, one of the problems has to do with the database itself and the data that is available. In the Handschriftencensus, as I said, you cannot access directly the database, and some of the information is not standardized, which means, for example, information about place of composition, language, and date are in very different formats. So sometimes you can find something like beginning of the 15th century, sometimes you can find a number. So being able to put all that data together to make sense of it would mean some effort. Also interesting could be to have the genres label, as a label for each kind of node done manually, and then compare that with the clusters created by the network. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done in the future with this kind of approach. And yeah, my idea would be that this mathematical modeling of data for medieval German literature can help us assess better the textual transmission. And an adequate overview, I think, is the basis to be able to evaluate individual texts. So my goal would be that a better understanding of medieval transmission as a system would allow to evaluate the transmission of individual works even better. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk, and I'm sure there are many questions in the room. So who wants to start? Don't hesitate. Okay, so maybe I will start then, because I also have some questions. So it seems very interesting to me, because your experiment was mostly conducted on metadata, right? For now, is there any chance that you can access the actual text as well and compare the differences between them, or is it like a wishful thinking, but it's not really possible?
Not in the near future, no.
Okay.
I'm probably not in the medium future,
Okay.
like in the long future maybe, and that would be very interesting.
Yeah.
There are many problems with the collections of texts and corpora of medieval German texts, and there are some of them, but as you see, there is like, for example, 6,000 works, and so it's a lot of text. So that will be pretty. Yeah, maybe in the distant future we'll have something like that. One thing that with which I've been working out also lately is the rubrics, which usually work as the title for those texts. So I've been collecting some of them, and I think that it would be interesting to make, to take also that data that is at least a part of the text, and how medieval scribes named or assigned some sort of label to these works, and that could be crossed with this kind of approach, I think, I hope.
Yeah.
So this was fascinating. Of course, it would be fun to be able to do it on text.
Not even just text, but even just the
Perhaps it's a good thing, because then if the
layout.
results would be, if the networks would be totally dissimilar from what you have now, then we'll be very disappointed. So perhaps it's better not to know. Anyway, could you return to where you sort of show the general parameters of your network? Because I'd like to look at there we go. So you look at the diameter, radius, average path curve. Okay. Anything else we could use here that would make sense? I don't know. I'm asking. Any other characteristics of the network?
I know these are the things I thought it could tell us the most in simple terms about the network. Maybe there are some other, like I think some features of the network wouldn't make a lot of sense, like considering the level of like, for example, how many nodes we could destroy to be able to maintain it connected or not. I don't think those makes a lot of sense in this network. But I don't know if someone has any ideas of which other features could be interested.
And what is called radius and shortest eccentricity? Could you explain that to me? Because I don't know.
Yeah, eccentricity is how many the length of the path that a node has to do to get to any other node. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So that means that the radius of 6 is like the text. It could be that we can think it this way, that the texts that are in the center are the texts that only with 6 steps can get to any other node.
Okay.
And that's the shortest you can get.
Right.
There is no node that can reach another there is no node that can reach all other nodes, only 5 steps. You need at least 6 steps for the most central nodes to be able to reach any other node.
So it's just like, aren't we like related to every other person in the world by 6 other people?
Yeah, that's the idea of the 6 degree.
This is why 666 is done wrong.
Yeah, so that's why I thought it would be interesting to compare it with networks from other languages or from other transmissions, because we could compare this number with some other sort of social network. And for example, we have this, I mentioned that game of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. So we know that 6 seems to be like a very normal number for many networks. But I think the real value would be if we find out that in French literature you need like 10. So that could, or like only 4 or whatever.
That would be like the French, wouldn't it?
So I think in that way you can really assess, we would be able to assess better what this actually means for the network.
Thank you.
Other questions?
If I think of Latin medieval manuscripts, which must be very similar to yours, the first thing that comes to my mind is that the number of, say, the copies of the Bible or the New Testament must be overwhelmingly, big, like 11,000 or so, right? Say about homilies, same about some exemplar, as it is referred to. So there's a relation of a huge bias towards church-related literature, which is copied with some errors, with some changes, and this is not the literature we usually are interested in. So, is there any way to deal with this bias, like thousands of manuscripts belonging to one genre, as opposed to humanistic poetry in just 5 manuscripts? Is it any way of dealing with that?
Well, actually, that's a thing I was pretty surprised when creating this network. Like, a lot of things pointed actually to not religious literature, even though also in German manuscripts you have, so religious texts tend to have a higher number of witnesses. But for example, when we do the clusters, like all the religious literature is in this green cluster, which is also the biggest cluster of them all. But it's just one big cluster, which is not that as interesting as the relationship in the other clusters. And when we do the centrality, like we see that most of the religious literature is just this huge yellow thing. And so I actually was surprised that maybe this approach of considering shared manuscript transmission and not just number of witnesses seems to be one way possible of going around that bias, and at least some sort of way, partly of overcoming that. So yeah.
Any questions? Okay, so if there are no more questions, then thank you once again, and it's been a pleasure. And we don't have any meetings planned yet, so we'll let you know when it's done. Thank you.
Thank you very much.